Hello. Test, test. Alright, so, I'm recording another video. I played a game, hide the move list, against a lower rated opponent, about 1400. Ignore this rating, I don't really play on chess.com. But, I thought the game itself was very instructional, and I hope to, provide some instructional value, by analyzing this. And the reason why you'll see is because we get into a queenless middle game where, black is quite a bit better, but it's not always necessarily easy to see how that happens. So, we play the game out. I play the French, nothing out of the ordinary. Maybe bishop d3 was a little weird. Usually I would expect to see like e5 or e takes d5 or even like knight g e2. Well, I guess I don't have to specify g because only one knight can move. But I thought it was a little odd. That's alright. So c5, I want to break in the center. I'm planning to meet a3 with capturing on c3. And then the nice thing is, when I capture on e4, I'm able to exchange down in this queenless middle game, recapture. And it's interesting because my opponent in the game actually asked me, he said, you had an opportunity to triple my pawns here. I would have had tripled pawns on these three squares. And he goes, why did you opt not to do that? And my answer is, I like this bishop more than I like the prospect of giving him triple pawns. That and the fact that I can preserve the bishop with tempo, right, because I'm hitting f2 here. That's important to note. But that's my main answer. Is I like this bishop more than I would like to give him tripled pawns. And to break down why, let's think of it like this, right? I have this nice kingside pawn chain, right? So I have a kingside majority. Let's see if I can get a different color. Right? My opponent has a queenside majority. So when you look at the structure, you want to look at what color are most of my pawns placed on. And in this case, the central chain is placed on light squares, making my dark square bishop the better minor piece, right? This guy's not going anywhere. So part of the difficulty of the French is figuring out, okay, how am I going to activate this bishop? And a lot of the times, like say in the advance, when it goes d7, you can play something like knight a5 and then bishop b5 and swap it off. But here, I can't even play something like bishop d7 to c6 because then b7 would hang. So it's a bit difficult to get that piece in action, but nevertheless, my opponent defends his pawn. The other option he had, well, he had a couple. He could have gone here or here. Issue here is I can play e5, and then this is a structural issue, right? Same thing if he goes here. And if you're in a middle game, structure by itself doesn't necessarily mean anything, right? Because you can utilize, well, I guess an isolated queen pawn is a perfect example. You have an isolated pawn, but as compensation, you will have the open files, right? And you won't have a bishop that's blocked in by a diagonal like my bishop is. So that's a sort of compensation you can get for doubled pawns. So it's important that you make the most use of that compensation. Otherwise, you will just have an isolated pawn or doubled pawns or whatever your damage structure may be for no compensation. And obviously, some is better than none. So king e1, defending his f-pawn. I get to develop with tempo, and you may be asking, well, why do you say with tempo when these pieces are of equivalent value? Reason being is, remember earlier I talked about getting this bishop into the game? If he lets me capture on e4, then I am substantially better, right? Because this bishop will have this beautiful diagonal, and then my knight will have its more natural square, working with this knight here on f6, and then I can maybe move this guy down the board, or I'll have so many more options. I could even do something like knight b6 and then clamp down on the d5 square, right? I have so many more options if this bishop isn't here. Because this bishop, with its pressure on b7, is what's limiting my bishop. So anyways, he retreats, naturally. A castle. Knight ge2, makes sense, you want to develop it. Knight c3. So, I'm essentially saying, I'm willing to take on the isolated pawns. Both my A pawn and my C pawn will be isolated. And the compensation that I'll have for that is this bishop, right? Because now the bishop that was previously locked in by those bad pawns is free. Right? It can do whatever it wants. It's not stuck guarding this B pawn. Even if he opts not to take, then it's just stuck here on d7. It doesn't have a future. I need to play something like e5 and maybe even e4 at some point, but then if I play e5, I don't have this compact structure anymore, right? So it becomes more difficult to defend that e-pawn. So anyways, bishop g5 makes sense, wants to damage my structure, and here I opted to play bishop e7, right? I don't want to give any sort of concession that would allow white play, right? Like, I already think that I am substantially better here. One, because my king is better, so this rook is active, right? Because there are two parts of castling. The first part is that your king is safe, right? It's comfortably tucked in behind these pawns. It's very slow at highlighting squares, but it's comfortably tucked in behind the pawns. But the other aspect of castling is it activates your rook, and that's the issue that white has, right? King safety isn't an issue because queens are off the board. We haven't exchanged any minor pieces, but there's no real threat of getting checkmated. But this rook is going to have a very difficult time getting into the game. So he takes, opts to give me the isolated pawn, and immediately attacks it, which I think is perfectly valid, right? Oh, and going back briefly, the other issue, the reason why I played bishop e7 is I don't want to allow any sort of knight e4 after bishop takes f6. That would be quite annoying. Anyways, so takes, I defend, and now I'm getting ready to play c5 and get this beautiful diagonal for my bishop, right? So my opponent did me a favor, and you'll see the compensation that I'm talking about. So I have this isolated pawn, like I said, but the compensation is this bishop. King e2 makes sense. He wants to bring this rook into the game, getting rid of the other drawback of not being able to castle. c5, activating my bishop, threatening to win a pawn. Retreats to f3, makes perfect sense. Now I can't win g2. And at this point, I want to gain some space, right? Because space allows my pieces to maneuver and cramps my opponent a bit. So I just expand on the king side, threaten to win the bishop. And here, I think I should have played... I made a mistake here, and I played g4 immediately. I think I should have played a rook to c1 first, just to get the bishop off of this diagonal. And you'll see later on how if I didn't have the bishop on this diagonal, I would have won substantially more easily. But anyways, g4. Not that my move is losing, I just had better. Knight h4. And then now you'll see the issue that I had where I'm not really able to trap this knight. I would like to be able to control these squares to trap the knight, but unfortunately that just isn't possible. Not that it necessarily would have been anyways, but my opponent just blundered here with rook g1 because I have a discovery on the bishop, so I am able to significantly improve my pieces with tempo. He attacks, and here I missed another tactic, right? I should have definitely played rook d8 here and then come in, and this would have just been absolutely crushing. And I had just missed that, and that was an error on my part. I'm even almost seeing mating ideas, right? Because after this, the only squares you can go to are those two. If he goes here, it blunders mate in 2, right? Well, mate in 3, I guess. I missed the pawn could block. So if he goes here, then I can take, and then I have threats of bishop check followed by mate, etc. So I just missed a really good winning opportunity there. I played c4. The main idea being I just want to make sure that I don't, one, just blunder the pawn for 0 compensation, and 2, I wanted to give my dark square bishop some more room. And I even set a little bit of bait, which he took, because he missed a tactic, and you'll see as we go. But this sort of game I think is instructional because it's not like I, boom, played a knight fork and won as queen. It was kind of more slow and positional, just in the sense that my pieces are better placed than his, and because of that, I have better opportunities. So I missed my chance to play rook d8 and played c4 instead. Get my rook out of the way. It's the only square I could go to besides h7. I didn't really see a difference. I just figured it's better to overprotect my bishop and also deprive the knight, of the g6 square again. He takes the pawn. And we can see immediately there's a tactical issue with taking this pawn because I can just pin it, right? And remember that pawns are the only pieces in the game that cannot move backwards. So when you make a pawn move, you create an irreversible weakness. And the only ways for white to defend this knight are either king d3 or b3. And notice that both of those have issues. So say, for example, king d3. Now we can pin this bishop, right? And because the knight is pinned, I'm threatening to just take the knight and then take the bishop. But there isn't really a good way for white to stop that at all, and he should just resign. In the game, we played b3 instead. So now I have not one, but two pins, because now this bishop is also pinned. This knight is also pinned. And in a lot of cases, when you have a beautiful bishop like this, it's not always worth the exchange, but given the fact that queens are off the board, we are starting to move into an endgame, I think that rooks are definitely more powerful because we are getting to a point where we are gaining access to open and semi-open files, right? So now he has not one, but two pinned bishops, and that I said bishops again, I'm sorry, pinned knights, and that's going to be an issue. He tries his best with king d3 to hold on, but then after rook d7, it's just over, right? I think it's interesting because literally all of his minor pieces are pinned. I didn't notice that until just now, but yeah, so at least one of these pieces is going to be lost, right? Because right now I'm already threatening to take the rook, and there isn't a square that the king can go to. Afterwards, it also defends this knight. If the king moves, say, back to d2, then I take on c4 first. And then after b takes, then I take the bishop. And then, again, there's no defense of this knight either, so all of his pieces are falling off. I hope that game was instructive. Just shows how I would play against a lower-rated player. And just to briefly glance back through, I did unfortunately miss an opportunity here with rook d8, where this would have been absolutely crushing. But overall, you can see how my kingside space really helped find my pieces nice squares, and at the same time really limited my opponent's pieces, right? Because where's this knight going? It can't even play the game. You'd have to spend several tempi just to activate it. And even then, you'd have to do something like this, but then I would be able to take the file in time too, so it's not even like you have time for that. I just found that to be pretty instructive. And the ending was quite neat as well, with all the pinned pieces. I think that's all for this episode. I hope you enjoyed. Please remember to like, subscribe, and if you have any questions, ask them in the comments, and I'll do my best to answer you. Have a good one.